o'clock, and we're on the infrastructure session. And Cheryl, would you like to introduce our speakers?
I would. Hold on one moment.
They should be unmuted now.
They're unmuted.
Emily, can you hear me?
I hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Spencer, you hear us?
Hi, good morning. Yes.
Okay, so we both, Emily and Spencer, are on. Okay, hold on one moment. So our first two speakers, do we have a roving mic? No, I think we just have that one. Okay, that's okay. Emily McKenzie is actually in London, which is one of the reasons they are first, because we needed to kind of work with their time change. But she joined World Wildlife Fund in 2008 and leads work on valuing nature and quantifying natural capital. She has been involved with the Natural Capital Project, and Spencer Wood works directly with partner organizations in Canada and Belize. He's in Stanford, and he's been evaluating coastal management plans using tools produced by the Natural Capital Project. His research focuses on empirical and mathematical approaches to understanding interactions between humans and the environment. And with that, give me a sec here. We're going to get their presentations up. And Spencer and Emily, if you guys could just let us know when you would like us to switch the slide. That's the main thing that we're going to need from you.
Sure.
Thank you. Oops.
Is the sound okay? I'm hearing a bit of an echo.
It actually sounds great here.
Okay, I'll just have to live with that. So thank you very much for inviting us to join. I'm also very grateful you let us go first so I can get to my bed in good order. So today we're going to present on work being done by WWF and our partners in the Natural Capital Project. Spencer and I are going to co-share the presentation, so I'm going to begin and conclude, and Spencer's going to dive into some of the science deliverables. So if you could switch to the next slide, please.
Sure.
So we're going to be presenting an initiative called Ideas, and we're going to run through this pretty swiftly given the short time because we'd like to have time for questions. We'll lay out what we're hoping to achieve, our objectives, and then really dive into the deliverables of the first phase of work, which has really just been a sort of first foundation setting phase, and then conclude with some initial thoughts on where we may go in the future and our first reactions of the links to the US Arctic Research Commission's goals and objectives. But would really appreciate a discussion with you about how that may link to your existing objectives and future ones. Next slide, please. So Ideas is it stands for Informing Decisions for Ecological and Economic Arctic Sustainability. It's an initiative that recognizes the Arctic is at this critical juncture with climate change and development pressures, and that new investments in infrastructure are predicted to increase significantly in the decades to come. So as this climate and other changes are occurring, we see it to be critical that people are making decisions informed with the best science and models, and specifically to use this information to support achievement of the SDGs. And we don't have time to go into the kind of backdrop of work that has been done by the WWF and partners in the Natural Capital Project elsewhere in the world. I know Fran is familiar and others may be, but we can take any questions on that. But the main emphasis is around stakeholder engagement and engagement with decision makers to see how decisions affect nature and the benefits that those nature provides to people. So what we're looking at is for opportunities to leverage that kind of approach in the Arctic with a specific focus on infrastructure. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So we're just going to focus really on phase one, which has been this initial phase of work to set a foundation. So WWF and the Natural Capital Project have been working with innovation funds from WWF and also support from a financial institution called Guggenheim Partners, and we've begun to create the sort of foundation of information that could form this initiative. So setting the groundwork. We've done 3 things in this first phase: an inventory of key data sets and science providers that you would need to do this kind of assessment, developed a simulation games, kind of a board game to examine the consequences of alternative development options in the Arctic, and then undertaken a review of leading infrastructure sustainability standards and screening tools. So what we thought we'd do is cover each of these briefly in turn, and then conclude with where we see some of the links to the Commission's goals and objectives and the next, the ideas we have for the next phase of work. So I'm going to hand to Spencer now, if you could move to the next slide.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me, Carrie?
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure thing. How's that?
Okay, we can make it work.
I'll do my best. So like Emily said, if we're headed in this direction of using some amount of science to inform these investment decisions, the obvious first question is what information is available, what type of knowledge and data and models do we have in the region. So we set off to catalog what we were thinking of as key information that might feed into models on the biophysical environment, the social environment, the built environment, and catalog the key science providers from the region, just to understand where we're at there. We were looking across terrestrial as well as coastal and marine systems globally, and prioritizing publicly available data so that whatever tools come out of this initiative would be using transparent information available kind of on a even playing field, with the goal, like we said, of understanding the potential for these models to inform decisions there. That inventory is available. We can share the link around again. Next slide, please, Carrie. To just give a few, I don't want to linger too long on this, but give a few details on what we concluded from our quick gap analysis was that indeed there are a large number and variety of primary data available, not surprising to some of you, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. The biophysical environment is much better covered globally than information on people of the region, particularly physical data on atmosphere, temperature, permafrost, sea ice extent, etc., from sources like the Global Terrestrial Network on Permafrost, National Snow and Ice Data Center, great resources. There's reasonably good distribution of dominant flora and fauna for some regions. There in Alaska, there's of course the Audubon Ecological Atlas, the CAF Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, etc. But comparatively little data on predictions of future distributions of taxa. On the social side, demographic data are available regionally, particularly in Alaska actually, but lacking for a lot of other regions around the Arctic. In Alaska, there's the Survey of Living Conditions, some good data from the Alaska Department of Commerce. But outside of Alaska, not a lot of good information on human uses, recreation, tourism, subsistence use, etc. And quite often those social data are just less spatially explicit. So we're seeing that there's some challenges to overcome. Maybe the next slide, please, Carrie. But nonetheless, there are some great resources. Here's just a screenshot of looking across kind of the largest 6 clearinghouses that are providing machine-readable data at the moment, primary data. There's not surprisingly, there's geographic differences in data availability. Alaska and North America are especially well covered. But there is a wide variety of public data available that hasn't been adopted into these kind of metadata standards. And I think if there were efforts to catalog information and catalog metadata, it'd be much more widely available across the region. Nonetheless, the take-home message from this is that there is a tremendous quantity, there's a tremendous variety of data available, and a network of institutions and individuals, I'm sure many of whom are sitting there in the room, who can support these types of assessments. Maybe the next slide, please, Carrie. I wish we could go into it, but like Emily was alluding to, we've done a lot of work elsewhere thinking about ways that maps and models can illuminate how these infrastructure investment decisions can create trade-offs, create impacts, create benefits. There's a map on your screen there of work we did in BC informing how aquaculture and infrastructure might impact the ecological environment. I think some of you are aware of the potential port expansions. There's new shipping routes through the Bering Strait that WWF worked on, and how those might lead to changes in access to resources or affect people's livelihoods. And we're thinking that down the road, these analytical methods are going to continue to facilitate local planning, allow people to compare multiple visions, options for the future, and compare think about how to best do these types of infrastructure investments. That's the take home from the data and information inventory. I'll touch briefly on the game now, the simulation game that Emily mentioned. It's on the next slide. We called this game Arctic Choices. It was designed to illustrate some of the benefits and costs of development decisions in the Arctic. It's played in an interactive session. We did it at several events this year. I think maybe some of you were subjected to it. The next slide, please, Carrie, shows a picture of folks playing the game. It's just a tabletop exercise, essentially, where people approach the game thinking of themselves as investors or developers and interested in maximizing profits. And then in round two, they unfold the bottom half of that board there, which I think is shown on the next slide, please. And of course, you might have guessed, they're forced to think about some of the trade-offs that come with these investments in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems and ecosystem services that are often underappreciated in planning. So for instance, here in this hypothetical Northland place, we're showing how potential investments might pose risk to subsistence use and tourism that depend on those functioning ecosystems. And of course, the board is rigged, not surprisingly, to force people to struggle with that placement of different activities and think about the trade-offs and synergies of them. The game is available online. I think the link was on the screen, but we can send it around. And I think it's back to you, Emily, for the next section.
Yeah, so the final thing we've done in this first phase is in partnership with AECOM, who were a great partner to work with because of their expertise in infrastructure. They work on designing, building, financing, and operating infrastructure in more than 150 countries, and then they also have expertise on climate risk and resilience and natural capital approaches. So we asked them to undertake a desk-based review of publicly available standards, guidance, and tools that are used to assess the sustainability and climate risk of infrastructure development projects. The list you've got here is just a subset of what they covered that are focused on infrastructure standards. They also looked at the sustainability and climate risk screening tools of the major multilateral development banks, groups like the International Finance Corporation, or the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on. But I think there are some insights there that can be useful for the Arctic. But I thought what was most relevant here is these standards. And what they did, I mean, you may be familiar with some of these standards. What holds, and I would say the Equator Principles and the Green Guidelines are somewhat different, but the SURE standard, Envision, SQL, and BREEAM, what they all do is assess, rate, and certify the sustainability of infrastructure projects, and to a lesser extent, master planning, using a set of criteria that a user needs to respond to and gather evidence to support that response of how they're meeting those criteria. And they will have online platforms. Not all of them are free. Envision and SURE are free. The others require you to pay for the service. And so we're interested in reviewing these because they would be these globally recognized standards that we think could be potentially applied and adapted to ensure the sustainability of infrastructure in the Arctic and elsewhere. So you could go to the next slide, please. And I'm afraid this, I just noticed at the end that this slide has been distorted in the way it got transferred to PDF. So there's multiple types of blue here, but the middling blue should actually be white, which makes it very hard to read. So I will just give you the kind of headline finding, which is that there is significant scope for more work in the planning phase, because all of that stuff you're seeing as middling blue is actually white. It means that these screening tools and infrastructure standards are not really covering them, but yet so much more of the impact on environmental and social benefit can be done if we ensure that infrastructure development in the planning phase is meeting national development agendas rather than project by project further down when you get into the design around already pretty well thought through projects. So we see that as an important gap, not only in the Arctic, but globally. If you could move to the next slide, please. So yeah, I guess I've covered this really. We see this gap in planning tools. We see the potential for some of these infrastructure standards to be used and adapted to the planning phase in particular. We'll be looking into in more detail, I think, in the next phase, two tools that are called Envision and Shore, which look to be two leading standards that cover comprehensive dimensions of sustainability and climate. If you could go to the next slide. So the Shore standard is one of these that is quite interesting. It stands for the Standard for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure. It has pretty comprehensive coverage, and it's also compliant with something called ICEAL, which you may be familiar with. It's sort of the standard of standards, and something that WWF will only endorse a standard if it meets. It's going to be released at COP23 in Bonn. So we're actually invited the CEO of Global Infrastructure Basel, who've developed this standard, to come to Arctic Circle, and we're running some sessions there later this week to present it and kind of explore, get some local Arctic reactions to this and other standards to see how they could be adapted and how the kind of tools and approaches that Spencer just presented could be applied to measure specific indicators that match those standards of sustainability. So in conclusion, if you could go to the final slides, please. For phase 2, we're just, as I said, completed this phase 1, and we're now in this careful process of consultation and thinking about what phase 2 should look like, early brainstorming, and we'll be doing this consultation at Arctic Circle on this later this week. But what we think is we'd like to do further review to really help in the Arctic to establish standards for sustainable infrastructure that are a good fit for the region, and help to develop these decision support tools that can help to implement them, ensuring that many can apply them. Next slide, please. That would include investors to decrease the risks of potential infrastructure investments and include, so basically create these pipelines of sustainable projects, governments to do the early upstream planning, and communities who are relying on this infrastructure, and ecosystems, both grey and natural infrastructure, to promote their security and well-being. So we're thinking through how this would work in practice. Final slide, please. So we just had a first read of the report you guys have on your goals and objectives. This table has your objectives listed, and the darker green ones are the ones we think are most relevant. So our takeaway was that the work we're doing is relevant to every one of your goals. Obviously most relevant to the built environment goal. And I would be interested to hear your reactions, but also your goals on one on observing environmental change, because the tools we'll do will be looking at scenarios, looking at climate and other drivers of change for any decision making, improving human health, because we're using this ecosystem service approach, so looking at the impacts on things like food and fresh water and hazard risk, which obviously have a direct relation to people's well-being and health, and community resilience. And we really hope and intend to develop this co-produced with local communities and Indigenous knowledge. And less relevant to the energy and science cooperation one, but still there's a link there, because we'll be looking at energy infrastructure projects to screen using these same tools and standards, and making everything we do freely available and open source. So sorry, went a minute or two over time. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, great. Unless there are any burning questions, we have a session at the very end, or 15 minutes at the end of this session, to be able to ask questions and discuss. So I'm going to move on, unless someone has a burning question, to our next presenter. Thank you, Emily and Spencer. Our next presenter is Sally Cox. She's a planner and a program manager at the State of Alaska Community and Regional Affairs, and she is in charge of FEMA Risk Map in conjunction with FEMA in a state-federal partnership. Okay, did I get that right? If you could come up and use the microphone, that would be great. I don't know if you were here earlier. We've got folks online that are watching this as a webcast, so that's why the microphone is important.
And this is also being recorded. Just
Okay.
Not to make you nervous.
You'll have to forgive me because I speak to my slides, so I'm going to have to turn my head over so I can see them. As Cheryl said, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning. As Cheryl said, I work for the Division of Community and Regional Affairs, and that is the local government agency for the state of Alaska. My background is community planning, and I've been involved in adaptation planning.
Pointer, and now don't touch that.
Okay, if I goof up, I will ask you that. I've been involved in adaptation planning with communities in the state that are dealing with the impacts of flooding, erosion, and permafrost degradation for a little over 11 years. I started working with the village of Newtok in 2006. So over the last decade, there's been a lot of discussion about adaptation responses to climate-related hazards. At the time of the state's climate change subcabinet, when there was a group called the Immediate Action Working Group, there were 3 primary adaptation responses that were identified, and they're listed here. I'm not going to go into detail on those right now, but a really important question that came out of this, and I see that my pictures disappeared. Interesting. A really important question that came out of this is how can communities best understand their risk to make informed decisions about how to respond to risk? And in 2008, we thought we came up with a pretty good solution. The state established the Alaska Climate Change Impact Mitigation Program in 2008. And the intent of that was really to help communities develop a planned approach to shoreline protection, building relocation, and or eventual relocation of the village. And those are those 3 primary adaptation responses that I had talked about on the previous slide. The program was carried out in 2 steps. The first step was a hazard impact assessment where the hazard risks were identified and studied, and recommendations were made to the community about some of the next steps that they could take to respond or adapt to that risk. And then the second stage was a community planning grant where the community could then pursue one or more of the recommendations that came out of the hazard impact assessment. It was a very effective program, although it wasn't well funded. The funding stopped in 2011, so unfortunately it's not a viable option for communities today to be able to get information on their risk. But in 2009, FEMA launched the Risk Mapping Assessment and Planning Program, or Risk Map. And Risk Map really was intended it replaced FEMA's prior mapping program, and it was intended to provide a more holistic approach to risk reduction, where FEMA and the state and other subject matter experts would go in and work with the community, try to identify and help the community work through the different hazards that they were dealing with, and really an intent to integrate floodplain management and hazard mitigation planning, which are 2 FEMA-funded efforts. The goal of Risk Map was to increase community resilience by providing quality data and risk assessment tools to communities to inform their decision-making and then in turn lead to action to reduce risk. The issue here, though, was that the program really has focused on communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the key products that came out of the program were flood insurance studies and flood insurance rate maps. The flood has clearly been an issue and something that the state has to deal with. We don't have data like this for erosion or permafrost degradation because neither of those hazards can be declared as disasters under FEMA's regulations. However, I think that this really shows how significantly flood and severe storm events have increased over the last 25 years. But I think it's also significant to note that the two areas where most of these events are taking place are in two census areas, Bethel and Yukon-Kayakuk, in Alaska's unorganized borough, where there's no regional form of government to provide additional resources to the communities. Of the 74 populated communities within the two census areas together, only 7 participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. More than half of the communities cannot participate because they're not incorporated as municipalities and therefore cannot regulate land use, which is a requirement of the flood insurance program. So this clearly presented a dilemma to the state for how we were going to continue to provide assistance to communities that were dealing with these impacts. And after a lot of discussion with FEMA clarified for risk map that risk map studies don't have to result in flood insurance studies and flood insurance rate maps. Communities don't have to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. The state can set as a priority a focus on imminently threatened Alaska Native villages. And the non-regulatory products and tools of risk map can be tailored to be most useful to communities. And a couple of examples here are we can translate documents into native language, and we can develop report formats that are more useful to community to really maximize risk communication to these communities. So how are we going to select the communities? Well, I was hoping that Don Antrobus would present before me so that you'd hear a little bit more about the statewide threat assessment project, but we're doing a flip-flop. But, and I'm not going to say too much about it because he's going to discuss it, but the Denali Commission is working on a statewide threat assessment. They're assessing risk for all communities throughout the state and then going to prioritize communities based on that risk. Now, for this new focus of risk map, which is on Alaska Native villages, we're not going to be looking at all communities because we've already been dealing with a large number of communities in the state that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. But we're going to take a subset of that. So in 2003, the US Government Accountability Office identified 213 Alaska Native villages. So we'll take that list, and however those communities are prioritized, we'll start working with the communities that are at highest risk. As we work through this process, because we're still developing the focus this year, we'll present the process and methodology to tribes and other stakeholders at local venues such as the BIA Providers Conference. We'll be doing a presentation on that at the upcoming Providers Conference here in Anchorage. The Alaska Tribal Conference on Environmental Management, which is called ACCM, and the Alaska Forum on the Environment. So this is the risk map process, and I'm going to move over here a little bit so I can see my slide a little bit better. But it begins with the discovery process, and that's when we go into the community and work with the community to identify what their hazard needs are and what areas they really would like to have studied. We begin the collection of new and available data, and this information is then summarized in what we call a discovery report, and that includes the scope of work for the risk map project. The next phase is the risk assessment and analysis phase, where FEMA and FEMA's contractor conduct risk and vulnerability assessments, and then they analyze the results and document those in a risk report for the community. During the risk reduction phase, we share the results of the risk assessments and the draft risk report with the community, and we work with the community to begin identifying strategies for risk reduction based on those hazards in the community. And finally, in the resilience phase, we work with the community to take all of this great information from the risk map process and help them find ways to integrate that information into local plans or to upcoming plans or other efforts in the community. And we also work with them to seek funding and to begin the implementation of mitigation or adaptation projects that have been identified during the process. Partnership and collaboration is a cornerstone of the risk map project. Up to this point, when we focus primarily on NFIP, which is National Flood Insurance Program communities, it's not unusual to engage the Corps of Engineers, U.S. Geological Survey, the Division of geological and geophysical surveys. So it's really important to do that. It's going to be especially important in the future because although FEMA has authority to directly address flood, they don't address many of the other types of hazards or resilience needs that these communities are dealing with that are listed in the bullets here. So that collaboration will be really important during the process. When the state of Alaska implements the RISMAP program, we enter into a cooperating technical partnership with FEMA. And the primary partnership is with my agency. We coordinate the overall program and set priorities for the new RISMAP studies. We work directly with the communities, but partnerships are also given to the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. They support us at our RISMAP meetings, but they also play a really important role because they develop hazard mitigation plans for communities. So they help integrate the risk map information into new and updated hazard mitigation plans. And this is a really important point because in the past, mitigation plans have been developed with the intent to meet the requirements of FEMA so that they can apply, the community can then be eligible to apply for hazard mitigation grant program funding. But because we'll be developing all of this robust data, there's new data now that can then be integrated into that new hazard mitigation plan. And then DHS and EM, Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, will also help identify mitigation projects through the process that can also be applied for through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And the Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys can conduct hazard assessments that FEMA does not. So for example, right now, with the village of Demonic, they're working on an erosion assessment, river migration study, and then they're also doing a landslide assessment for the city and borough of Sitka. So this slide just shows you some of the ways that we will be able to make RISMAP meetings more useful and meaningful to the communities that we'll be working with. A lot of these methods are techniques that my agency, DCRA, has employed over the years. Always hold the meetings in the village. If necessary, have an interpreter for the meetings to make sure that members of the community understand what's being said. Not necessarily doing your conventional meeting in the community, but holding a community gathering or a potluck. And then more culturally appropriate ways to present the information. The reports can be translated into native language. And I have a mock-up of one example that we've done in DCRA is synthesizing information from a hardbound report into a poster-sized document that can be hung in a common meeting area in the village so that people have the opportunity to take a look at it during the day, but also gather around it and discuss it. And so it's not going to be in this hardbound document that will be shelved away. So during the data collection and analysis section, and again, one of my photos didn't show up at the bottom, two things that FEMA has been very amenable to is integrating local knowledge into the process and also incorporating local observation as part of the process. And there are a number of community-based monitoring efforts that are currently taking place in Alaska. So this slide talks about, again, some of the RISMAP products and tools that we can specifically tailor to make more useful to the communities that we're working with. I already talked about the risk report and how that's the final report of the RISMAP process, and it compiles all of the information from the risk assessments so that the community understands what their risk is and then is informed about how they can act to reduce risk. We can also collaborate with other agencies to produce tools such as flood inundation maps, erosion assessments, and permafrost risk assessments. So RISMAP, and I've discussed this a little bit already, the tools and products and information can inform a number of other actions. We talked about the mitigation plans. The information can be integrated into a climate adaptation plan. Information can inform mitigation of adaptation projects, local land use plans, community comprehensive plans, analyses about protecting in place or relocating. And then I put at the bottom village planning group, and that's because a federal group called the ADEC Executive Steering Committee Community Resilience Working Group was calling these village planning groups, but it's basically the new top planning group that I've been coordinating for a number of years, and similar groups with the villages of Shishmaref, Shaktoolik, and Kivalina. And they're basically interagency groups that come together to work with the community to help the community develop a plan for how they're going to address their issues. So finally, in 2015, the implementation plan of the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission specifically recommended the risk map program to anticipate, evaluate, and respond to risk from climate change and support community efforts to adapt and relocate when necessary. It's interesting because if you look in the section on execution, they note, though as a FEMA-funded project, it is very specific to the communities it can include. That was when we thought that the program could only focus on communities that participated in the National Flood Insurance Program. Now we know that it can focus on all communities. And so the Alaska Arctic Policy Act, which was signed into law in 2015, supports the recommendations of the implementation plan. And so that is the end of my presentation, and I guess we're going to wait until the very end to deal with questions.
Yes.
I apologize because I didn't go through and identify your goals that this program would meet, but I believe it's goals 1 and 5 would be the ones that would be most appropriate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so following Sally, our next presenter is Captain Don Antrobus. He is a program manager at Denali Commission and previously an engineering manager at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And Don is a member of our Rural Alaska Water and Sanitation Working Group and has really helped us out with that.
Just
Thanks,
hold
Don.
on. Just hold on a sec. I gotta get you back up.
So, ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, good morning. My name is Don Antrobus, and I'm the program manager for the newest Denali Commission program, which is our Village Infrastructure Protection Program. The motivation for the development of the VIP program was a 2015 visit by then President Barack Obama to Alaska. And President Obama announced that the Denali Commission would serve as the central coordinator of federal efforts to assist communities to implement solutions to environmental threats such as flooding, erosion, and permafrost degradation. So our program boundaries are defined by a 2009 GAO report, which identified 31 communities facing imminent environmental threats. We have an annual, I guess one thing that I skipped that I'd like to mention about the Denali Commission assignment, that it didn't come with any new funding or specific authorities. So the program was crafted by our commissioners by taking funding from existing programs and assigning it to the new infrastructure protection program. So our boundaries are defined by this 2009 GAO report, which identified 31 at-risk communities. So we have an annual budget of approximately $5 million, with 80% of that providing direct support to the 31 communities, with most allocated to the 4 most threatened communities, Newtok, Kivalina, Shishmaref, and Shaktoolik. The remainder of our funding is being used for statewide initiatives and coordination efforts. And one of those efforts that I'll address today is a project that we call the statewide threat assessment. The primary intent for the threat assessment is simply to gain a better understanding of the environmental threats faced by all rural Alaska communities. So the 2009 GAO study identified 31 communities, but was based on a Corps of Engineers baseline erosion assessment. The development of the list didn't broadly consider either flooding or permafrost degradation, which are both generally understood to pose additional threats to many Alaskan communities. So in their report, GAO specifically recommended a flood assessment study to augment the core baseline erosion assessment. And simultaneously, the Immediate Action Working Group of the Governor's Sub-Cabinet on Climate Change recommended the development of a methodology to prioritize community needs based on risk. Earlier this year, the EPA released a report which estimated that approximately $5.5 billion of public infrastructure in Alaska is at risk due to climate change. This number likely underestimates the impact on rural infrastructure. So the study utilized existing readily available data sets to quantify public infrastructure. The State of Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities has an online database that identifies state roads and airports. So that type of infrastructure was easy to quantify. However, there's not a comparable product for sanitation facilities or rural energy and other public infrastructure. So the threat assessment project was born out of the need to address these gaps in our understanding of the environmental threat impacting rural communities. So the threat assessment that we're going to conduct will analyze existing data, not only for erosion, but also for flooding and permafrost degradation. So data on flooding, erosion, and permafrost degradation will be used to establish an environmental threat index for all rural communities in state with population greater than 20. So that aligns very closely with the 213 communities that Sally discussed a moment ago. So an individual threat assessment will be created for each of the 3 threats, and then an aggregate, there will be an aggregated score developed based on those 3 individual threat assessments. At the completion of the project, the data and scores will be entered into a GIS database, for future reference, and to provide the ability to update the data set as new information becomes available. The project is a collaborative between the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, and the Army Corps of Engineers Alaska District. So the Corps will be responsible for an update of the baseline erosion study based on new information that's available since the original study. They'll do an evaluation of flood risks, and they'll do the establishment of the threat index score for erosion and flooding. UAF will assist with the assistance from CREL, will be responsible for evaluating the risk of thawing permafrost, as well as for the integration of the individual risks into a composite threat score. So this project commenced in May of this year. To date, the Corps, the UAF have been gathering data, crafting surveys, defining scoring methodologies, and outlining the structure of the GIS database. So we expect to have the individual threat scores completed by February, and aggregate threat scores completed in early March. After we have the aggregate threat scores established, we'll be doing some outreach, holding public meetings at several regional venues, in order to present the methodology and gather input from stakeholders. So it's important to ensure that the methodology we use to create the threat index scores is generally acceptable to communities and state and federal partners. So after the incorporation of the public feedback, UAF will complete the database and issue the final report by June of 2018. So the multiple objectives and uses that we hope can be realized from the completion of the threat assessment. First, the database can act as a single access point for information on environmental threats. I'm going to circle back to this and discuss a little bit more about the database because I think it aligns well with one of the recommendations from the Arctic Research Commission. Now we hope to address the needs that were identified by both GAO and IAWG to advance a better understanding of the threats and vulnerabilities of rural communities. We think that ultimately the threat index can be used by federal, state, and private resource agencies to inform their investment decisions based on a completed picture of relative risk that communities are facing. So if the scoring methodology is widely accepted by other agencies, then it could help focus federal and state response to environmental threats on specific shared priorities. And then as a scoring criteria, we think it may also have value. Many resource agencies allocate their resources based on scoring criteria that don't provide a consideration for environmental risk. I'm most familiar with sanitation facilities, construction programs in the state, which award projects based on health impact, efficiency level, unit cost, and operation and maintenance best practices, but they don't consider the environmental risk. So if agencies were so inclined, to consider an additional environmental element in their scoring processes, then the threat assessment could provide a ready-made methodology for doing so. And finally, we hope that the assessment will provide some additional focus just on the sheer magnitude of climate impacts to infrastructure in rural Alaska. And perhaps in time, this information could help to encourage new investments in Alaska. So one of the ARC research recommendations for advancing the built environment is the development of a comprehensive inventory of public infrastructure. So the proposed GIS database that we will be constructing for the threat assessment, it'll take a few steps towards the fulfillment of this recommendations. It won't constitute a comprehensive inventory of public infrastructure, but it will contain some information on critical infrastructure at risk in communities. And it may be a platform on which such an inventory could be constructed at a later date. A couple of additional points that I'd like to make about the data set. We don't plan to reproduce information that's already housed elsewhere, but at a minimum, we would like this to act as a front door to that information with links to other data sets that we use in the analysis. And then we recognize that the environmental phenomena on which these threat assessments will be based is very dynamic. And that the threat indices that are developed will be static numbers based on the information available at the time that they're created. So therefore, this analysis will have to be updated at some point in the future in order for it to remain relevant. So we don't have a good sense of what that update cycle might be at this time, but I suspect that a comparison of the original core erosion assessment and the list of communities generated by GAO in 2009, and comparing that to the results of the current threat assessment in terms of risk, in terms of the communities that are identified to be at risk, may give us some insight into how often we have to update that study. If the list that we generate for the most high-risk community parallels very well with the GAO list, then perhaps a 10-year update cycle is reasonable. So a couple of program intersections with other activities that are going on around the state that I would like to mention, because it's very likely that we can mutually inform our respective projects. Fran mentioned this morning in her opening remarks, and I would just like to mirror those about the NOAA AIJ project, which is collaboration to conduct local monitoring of environmental threats in specific communities. The project partners participating communities with federal and state agencies to gather scientifically defensible measurements. So I think it's important for a couple of reasons. It puts communities in control of information that will guide their relocation decisions, which in some cases may mean, well, whatever their decisions are, in some cases it may mean a very difficult decision to relocate. And it's critical that state and federal agencies collaborate in that evaluation process so that a community can make a decision knowing whether or not their decision is supported by federal and state stakeholders. Dr. Tom Ravens of the University of Alaska with NSF funding is going to be conducting detailed coastal process modeling for several selected communities. Modeling can be used to help determine whether these coastal communities can implement civil works projects to protect in place or whether they will have to relocate. So the threat assessment that we're doing may be able to inform the selection of the study communities, and or information from the study communities can ultimately inform the threat assessment. Western Alaska LCC recently did some mapping in Western Alaska in the YK Delta and to the north. The State of Alaska DNR, Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys, is using some of that data to do some flood mapping. So they're using elevations from the survey, projecting floods onto that data and evaluating flood inundation in communities. Some of that data will be utilized to inform assessment. And then the FEMA risk map program that Sally just talked about, we hope that this threat assessment that we're conducting, will be able to inform the selection of communities into which they can do a deeper dive and to get a better understanding of the specific threats in the community. So in closing, one other Arctic Research Commission recommendation for observing, predicting Arctic environmental change was to map the distribution of warming permafrost throughout the state. This project that we're doing, won't be creating any new permafrost data and information, but we will be using data that's created out of other Arctic science initiatives, and using them to develop a better understanding of direct impacts on people. So from my perspective at the Commission, where our focus is on specifically on implementing infrastructure solutions, but I think it's important for us to continually ask how our research is resulting in or leading to solutions for people. How am I doing on time?
You're pretty much there.
Okay, can I go off track for just like 15 seconds? Not off track.
Tangent.
You talked about, Fran, you spoke to the catalog of federal programs like this morning. So the catalog is being updated by a detailee to the Denali Commission from Department of Transportation. We're going to be utilizing that document later on this month to conduct some tabletop exercises with Newtok and Shishmaref. And generally, the tabletop exercise will have the community sit down with the catalog of federal programs with their planning documents, along with another list of steps in a relocation process that Sally and I developed. And the objective would be for them first to sit down and using that list of relocation steps and all of their other planning documents to develop a 3 to 5 year implementation plan for their specific relocation effort. And then they'll take that plan and sit down and try to match it with federal and state resources in the catalog and see if they can actually fund their 3 to 5 year plan. So that's something that we're going to be doing in front of AFN on the 16th and 17th of this month.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. We'll take questions at the end. So our next speaker is Bill Griffith. Bill has managed the Division of Water Facility Programs in the state of Alaska, DEC, since 2004. And he's worked as a program manager as well at Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium for coming to work for the state. And he is also a member of our Rural Alaska Water and Sanitation Working Group, and is going to talk to us today about the Water and Sewer Challenge, which has just wrapped up its phase 3. And I'll remind folks here on the commission that we sit on the steering committee for this Water and Sewer Challenge. Okay, that's not a very good first slide. I don't know why it's, I think it gets better after that though, so. It looks like it does.
It seems to be fine on the webcast.
It's fine on the webcast? Okay. Yeah. Well, you're not gonna, unfortunately, your pictures on the first slide aren't there, but it looks like the rest are okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Strange.
Yeah, as Cheryl said, we're kind of in an interesting moment in the Water and Sewer Challenge. We're just at the end of phase 3. We haven't quite started phase 4, so I'm not really able to tell you exactly what the next phase is going to look like, but I'll tell you about where we've been. See if I can advance
right hand
here.
one, and you've got a pointer at the top. Just don't hit the bottom one.
Okay. Okay. I'm largely going to skip over a lot of the background about this project. We don't really have time today, but there is a handout out on the table at the front about the Alaska Rural Water and Sanitation Working Group, and it provides some good background about why we started the Alaska Water and Sewer Challenge back in 2013, 2014. This is a little bit of information about rural communities and how they their current status of water and sewer systems. You'll see that most communities have some kind of pipe system. A number have also individual well and septic tanks, covered haul systems, but we've got about 30 communities yet in Alaska that don't have any running water and sewer in the community. In addition, there's a bunch of homes in communities that have some kind of system, but we're not able to serve all the homes. So somewhere between 10 and 15% of rural Alaska homes still lack running water and sewer, which means really they don't have a flush toilet, they don't have sinks with running water. No good pictures.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, back in 2013-14, we started the Alaska Water and Sewer Challenge. It's a state and federally funded research and development project. Originally projected to last 5 to 7. We're bumping that up to 6 to 8. One of the things we found is that it's a difficult challenge to think about trying to develop some kind of a decentralized approach to household water and sewer. It is private sector driven. Ownership of intellectual property can be retained by project teams. Not all teams are actually electing to do that. Our goal is to significantly reduce the capital and the operating costs associated with in-home running water and sewer. Funding to date is about $4 million. Additional funding will be needed to complete the project. Early on, we established some performance targets associated with this project. Most importantly, we need to have acceptance by users. There's a big focus on getting input from end users throughout the project. All the teams work closely with at least 2 communities in different regions of the state. They travel to the communities travel into the working prototypes. What we're after is affordable operation and feasible capital costs, something that really we've reached a point with our traditional approaches that we find is no longer possible. We're looking at freeze recovery. As anyone who works in rural Alaska knows, houses go cold for extended periods of time. We're looking at something that's durable, parts are readily available, and most importantly of all, we're after sufficient water for health benefits. That's really kind of the key to all of this. As I mentioned, village input is a big part of this project. At the end of the day, if we don't have something that people believe is useful and operational and affordable, then really we haven't resulted in any kind of success. A little bit about the project timeline. Teams were formed back in 2013 and 14. They developed written proposals. Next, we had 6 of those developed. That was narrowed to 3 at the end, back in 2015. Since 2015, we've been engaged in phase 3, which is what we call prototype development and pilot testing. So we had 3 prototypes developed in different parts of the state by the different teams. Those 3 prototypes were up and running and for a period of at least 9 months, some of them much longer than that, where they were able to kind of test their system, figure out what worked and what didn't, and really all 3 systems, once they had them up and running, underwent a number of changes because they realized some things worked, some didn't, and the systems looked different at the end of that period than at the beginning. Last week, we had the 3 teams each present to the steering committee, kind of the results of their efforts. We know, like I say, what was successful, what they would like to continue to work on. The next phase, if we move forward, would be what we call field system development and testing, where we get into trying out those systems in real households. During the past phase, what they were utilizing was a recipe developed by NSF for household gray water. It turns out that household gray water is pretty challenging stuff, not just to treat and to deal with, but actually to just mix and utilize. It turned out to be pretty volatile stuff as far as how quickly it reacts, and it's a real challenge to handle. So in the next phase, if we move forward, they'll be dealing with real household gray water, which may turn out to be easier to deal with or harder. I guess we'll find out. And then beyond that, we would hope to move forward out into more rural environment and then continue to refine the technology down the road. So I'm going to quickly go through a little bit about what each of the teams came up with, what it looked like, how they were different. I'm going to start with the Dowell team, which was based up in Fairbanks at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center. Their system was what they call a vestibule attached to the side of the home with a kind of an accordion type connection so that it could move independent of the home. This is a schematic of their system. What they relied on was a couple of different filters, what they call a micro zeolite filter and a granular active carbon filter. And they had UV and then some kind of polishing filters and disinfection. I guess I'm not going to get into too much detail about each of these, but just try to give you an idea that so all of these systems recycle the gray water, which means water from bathroom, sink, shower, and the washing machine at least. UAA also was recycling water from the kitchen sink. There were, I'm not going to get into too much more of this one. The Dowell team also worked on and tested a countertop point of use drinking water systems. So you can see in the picture here, what they came up with was a couple of stackable 5-gallon buckets. And then inside that was a kind of a cartridge filter. And then in addition, on the bottom of the top bucket, there was a little disinfection added to the water. So this looks like it might be a promising idea for folks throughout rural Alaska that want to be able to utilize readily available traditional sources of water. A lot of folks don't like even the taste of the water at, say, community watering points. The difficulty with some of those traditional sources is they're not always safe to drink, so this might be a good fit for some of those homes. A little bit about the system in Tok, Alaska, developed by the Summit Engineering team. This system was developed to be kind of integrated into an existing home. In the photo on the left, you can see how they have a couple of water storage tanks that are built into the walls. And then the other unique thing about this system is they used a biological membrane reactor, which was a different approach than the other teams. You can see a picture of that on the right here. This is their schematic. Again, water from those different gray water fixtures is collected. It's put through a biological buffer skimmer tank, then through this MBR plant, little miniature plant inside the home. Again, there's UV treatment, ultrafiltration membrane, and then there's also a chlorine pump and into the storage tank. And then the other team was the UAA team here in Anchorage. Their system, it's missing a photo on the left, but their system was installed in a small kind of half-size Connex unit next to the home. And this is a picture of their system that they developed in the lab, and then it was moved into that Connex. Their process schematic, what they did was they had a nanofiltration followed by reverse osmosis membrane and then UV disinfection. Like I said, they also took water not just from the bathroom sink, the shower, and the washing machine, but also from the kitchen sink. I just want to mention that, again, I'm sorry, missing photographs here. This didn't work this way yesterday. But all three teams suggest that a dry or separating toilet might be a good fit for homes that want to conserve water. So we're taking a look at that. Some of you are familiar with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium developed a in-home system called the PASS system that utilizes a dry toilet. And that might be a good fit for homes that want to conserve water, because at the end of the day, most of these recycling systems, the primary cost is associated with either bringing water into the home or hauling wastewater away. So that's what we're trying to reduce by recycling, and one of the big water users in the home is a toilet. So if people can find a way not to have a flush toilet, that might be a good fit. So a little bit of review of phase 3 here. We funded 3 teams for prototype development and testing. The steering committee is currently deciding next steps, which may include further development of individual system components, including drinking water, gray water recycling, and toilet. Additional research on household water use in rural homes is needed. We based a lot of our targets on household water use in other parts of the country. Of course, we know that water use in rural Alaska is probably different than that, so we're looking at doing some additional studies on that. And before full household use could be tested, we need to develop something we're calling health advisory limits on kind of exposure to recycled gray water. If we move forward with that, we would really be the first in the country to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have anywhere else to turn to for those kind of health advisory limits. And that's the end of my short presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions from the commissioners, and I'm going to ask that folks use the microphone just because it's going to be hard otherwise for folks online to hear the questions. Does anyone have any questions?
First of all, thanks very much to all of our presenters. A very content-rich series of presentations. Thank you very much. And I think many of us knew some of what you have been doing, but it was really helpful to hear them all 3 together, and actually all 4 together. I have 3 quick questions, one for each of you, and I'll just pose all of them, and perhaps others will also ask questions, and then you can answer as appropriate. So, Bill, I'm curious about the 10% of unserved communities. Do they tend to be the smallest? Do they tend to be the most remote, the most distant from a water source? I'm just curious if that 10% happens to be, you know, if there's some unifying characteristic of why they are unserved. Sally, my question for you is with regard to the communities that FEMA can actually help. I think I heard you to say that it's not just flooding risk, it's others as well, but I'm not clear on what the criteria may be for FEMA beyond flood risk communities, for flood insurance, et cetera, which communities FEMA can actually help in the planning process. And Don, you mentioned public hearing process in March. I'm a little curious about what your thought is about the public outreach process and whether or not you're thinking about using existing forums where there will already be a variety of people from all over the state, like, for example, the Forum on the Environment, which is usually held in February, and other events where, you know, you actually have people already coming together where you could do that kind of truth testing, or if you have a different strategy for your public hearings. So those are my questions. I don't know if you each want to answer those before we ask other questions.
Sure, I'll just quickly say that the remaining 30 or so communities do tend to be a little on the smaller side. We have some very small communities in that group, some of them as large as 400 or 500 people. They do tend to be remote, and then there's generally a challenge as far as building materials. Things like gravel may not be readily available, maybe no good water source available, and also maybe difficult to think about siting something like a lagoon. So those are some common characteristics of those communities.
And we're still developing our strategy, how to go about that public outreach. We would like to do it regional. We don't want to do it all here in Anchorage. So I think we'll travel a little bit and perhaps hit, I don't know, Kotzebue, Fairbanks. And we'll pick some regional centers to go so that we can reach a wider audience. And certainly if there are existing programs, we will try to take advantage of those. But other than that, we haven't developed it to that point.
Great. Thank you, Fran, for that. That was one of my questions about the public meetings, Don. And I'm glad to hear you're saying Kotzebue, but I think it's real critical as a suggestion to seriously think about those villages you mentioned or was mentioned earlier that are seriously impacted, such as Kibbeling in the region that I live in. I think this is what we tend to hear, how we gather in Anchorage like we are now with this commissioners meeting, and we're always grateful for guests to come to Kotzebue, but again, within our own region, we tend to hear from our villages, why don't they come to our village? We're the ones that are residing in that community, to meet with the leadership there. So just as a suggestion, thank you.
So FEMA allows the state of Alaska to set the priorities for what the program focus will be and who the new communities will be. They want to see a fair and defensible method for how we prioritize, and that's why we'll be relying upon the statewide threat assessment. We are going to focus on the new communities on Alaska Native villages. FEMA is interested in working with tribes, and so that will be the criterion. They need to fit within that category that GAO identified for the 213 Alaska Native villages. So however they are prioritized, we will begin working with the ones that are most threatened. I don't believe that flood is going to be the only risk that we have to deal with. I mean, they've made it clear that we can look at erosion and permafrost degradation. They're limited in what they can fund in terms of new data acquisition. However, they can fund other agencies who have acquired that data to perform assessments on that data. So there would be a match that would be involved with it. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, Sally?
Yeah.
You had mentioned that, and I wrote it down, but I hope I re-quote correctly, that FEMA cannot use erosion and permafrost degradation as a disaster declaration?
Correct. Those are not included in the Stafford Act.
Do you think that has Stafford Act, has that ever changed? I mean, have they
No.
ever updated it?
I think a really good example is what happened recently with the village of Newtok, who tried to, as a tribe, request a federally declared disaster based on, I think it was primarily permafrost degradation, correct? But it was also erosion. But neither one of those are considered to be a single, the Stafford Act identifies single events. So a big storm that comes in and a flooding event that where you have a beginning and an end. And it's really difficult to do that with erosion or permafrost degradation because they're slow moving processes. So, you could take a look at erosion as part of a flood event if you lost a large portion of land, but the flood event would really be the determining factor.
Okay, so
Shortly after the Newtok disaster declaration, Kivalina also
Yes.
submitted a disaster declaration.
And both of those received a response that they were inconsistent with the Stafford Act. That was the limits of those.
So with respect to that, as an example, last week, Barrow had a very large storm, and we all know that there's not ice right now to lay down these storms that are really hitting the coast hard. They incurred over $10 million of damage in one day. That's not the kind of thing, if there was massive erosion along their road that goes out to the Gnarl, that's not the kind of thing that wouldn't qualify?
We have not seen that qualify yet.
Okay.
If they had really clear data on, what the circumstances. Oh, sorry. Perhaps if there was clear data on what the circumstances were ahead of the storm and what happened after, they could qualify for some imminent threat funding through some of the federal agencies. But I don't believe that the Stafford Act would cover that.
But storm-driven erosion does qualify under the Stafford Act.
Okay.
So there have been previous disaster declarations in the state that the damage was due to erosion, but they were able to connect it specifically to a storm. So the storm you're referring to should probably qualify.
Thank you. More questions?
Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for those presentations. This is more sort of thinking about where do we go from here, and it's probably best related to Dawn and maybe Sally. As I mentioned, I grew up in a small community, and my campus has a dorm of students, and the students talk about, am I really going to be able to live in my village when I'm done with college and all that? One question that some students in a class that I was guest speaking at brought up, and it's one that's also come up in Stebbins where I was born and raised. Most communities, I bet you all the 30 that are left, including Stebbins, that don't have running water and sewerage systems, the school or the clinic is certainly well serviced with modern facilities, but not private homes. In the future, in building, especially government buildings or agency buildings, if there's a way to, one, maybe make multi-purpose buildings. Some of the schools are not used at night, for example. If they could be multi-purpose to be community centers that could be used at night, that would reduce the amount of infrastructure that needs maintenance and operations and cost, is one thing. As aging infrastructure or permafrost degradation happens with these buildings and they need to be replaced, think more about what's a better model. And for places that do have running water, if there's a way to extend what's already there to private homes rather than building something totally new. I mean, a lot of these places have buildings with running water, have facilities with running water and sewage. Is there a way to extend them? I know that agencies have silos. I mean, public safety has a building and they dare not talk to someone from Health and Social Services that has a clinic. Why not? Let's think about the future and better ways to do things. There probably is a question embedded in there, but mostly it's a statement. Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond to that or just take it as documented? Thank you. Lawson, did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry, Jim, I didn't see you.
Thanks. Thank you again. Very interesting presentations all around. So Sally, I'm curious about how you can look at the erosion and thawing permafrost matter in a comprehensive way. Obviously, this is this problem that all the models suggest is going to become increasingly serious. So to what degree are you looking at climate projections or trying to ascertain how different the future might be from the present, or as we well know, the past? I'm reminded of a phrase probably everyone in this room heard at some point. The late Senator Stevens used to talk about this creeping climate disaster. And that's clearly what this is. I'm just wondering how you incorporate that sense of anticipation into this planning.
And that's a really excellent question. You know, I think the first step really is the community understanding what the longer term consequences are going to be of the hazard. And then developing a plan of action for that. And some of the adaptation responses that I talked about are, gradually moving structures away from hazard-prone areas, especially if there is good constructible land that's close by the community footprint. But I think that in some cases we're going to find that some of these communities, the locations where the communities are not sustainable over the long term. And so then it begs the question of, do we look at full-scale relocation? Do we look at a technological solution to some of these things? Or is there some types of development that's better suited to these environments? So it's a big question that I don't have a ready answer to, but it's something that we will certainly be working with the communities on. I've been working with communities on these types of issues for a long time, and they ultimately will have to make decisions about what road they want to go. But it's probably a much larger issue than we even realize right now.
Sure.
So I can speak to that briefly in terms of the threat assessment that we're conducting. So UAF and krill will utilize existing climate models in order to get kind of a microscopic view of where we anticipate changes to the permafrost, and we'll identify specific communities that may be susceptible to permafrost degradation utilizing those climate models. Then they will begin looking at some specific geotechnical data for those areas in order to determine, what the subsurface is like and whether the changing temperatures and melting of the permafrost will have detrimental effects. After that, it becomes a little bit more complex, to do some additional deep dive into the specific communities to understand what infrastructure they have that may be threatened, and also to understand a little bit about how the structures were built and if the engineering of the structure may be such that it's not susceptible. So all of that will have to be thought out. So they'll start at a higher level, identify specific communities, and then start to drill down and understand a little bit more about the specific impacts.
Thanks, great.
Question for the first speakers, if they're still online.
Yeah, just let me unmute them. Hold on.
Yes, it's Lawson Brigham, Advisory Commission. I wondered about sources of information. If you've used two sets of kind of wide sources. One, the World Economic Forum had two reports on demystifying the Arctic, about somebody trying to dispel the hype of this information about development in the Arctic, and also something called the Arctic Investment Protocol. And then finally, I suspect you rolled these into your studies, but the Arctic Council has a series of multi-million-dollar assessments over the last 15 years on oil and gas, shipping, climate, biodiversity, permafrost, and more. I wondered if you used these sources.
Emily and Spencer, are you still on? And did you hear the question?
I did, yeah. I can speak to the first part of the question, because I think the WEF reports and the Arctic Investment Protocol are probably most relevant to the review of standards that we did. So the review of standards that we did with AECOM was global. It was to inform WF's global work on infrastructure. So we didn't focus on the Arctic infrastructure, the Arctic Investment Protocol specifically within it. I mean, it's a very short, high-level piece. We're familiar with it. And I guess what we're seeing is this work reviewing these more substantive standards kind of helps to add some real meat to the bones of what the Arctic Investment Protocol is, which is, as I remember it, about sort of 10 very high-level principles, although it does relate to things like the IFC standards. And the two WEF reports you're referencing, I'm not sure if I am familiar with them, so it would be great to if you could share them. And I'll hand to Spencer for the reference to the Arctic Council reports on data.
Well, the Arctic Council reports are extraordinarily extensive, and they talk all about sustainability, governance of all of these issues. So since the Arctic states invested millions of dollars in these, and they're publicly available, they must underpin any holistic study of the Arctic, including yours, I would argue. I can fill you in on it. There is one other catalog of public and private infrastructure that the Guggenheim partners put together in support of this Arctic Investment Protocol. So there aren't many inventories of infrastructure, hard to do, and there is one.
I don't know if we have Spencer online or not.
Spencer, yeah, you there?
Yeah, hi, sorry. To comment on the availability of data more broadly, as well as the inventory of infrastructure. I think the way we envision this at the moment is thinking about the library of data and models and raw information that we have at our fingertips. And then, as Emily's saying, what we want to do is put meat on the bones of those protocols, but also those standards, and do that with specific local indicators that we can predict into the future with process-based models. And so that means yes, that means we're gonna get really specific about, where is infrastructure located, what are the biophysical processes that are going to lead to change on the landscape. And at this point, we don't entirely know what of the existing models we'll tap into and what of the existing data we'll need and how much new science we'll need done, but that's what we're scoping out now.
Okay, great. Any other questions for the speakers? Okay, excellent. I think we're pretty close to on time. I want to thank all of our speakers in the infrastructure session. That was excellent presentation.